The White House in the winter of 1846 was hushed, save for the flickering glow of oil lamps casting shadows on velvet walls. In a cluttered office, President James K. Polk sat slumped over his desk, crushed by the pressure of a rapidly expanding nation. Yet he was not alone. Opposite him sat Sarah Childress Polk, working under the dim light and sharing the weight of power with a resolve that matched his own. Instead of embroidery, she held a pen to edit important speeches and analyze secret telegrams from the Mexican front. She was not merely a first lady, but an unofficial prime minister, advising her husband on who to fire and how to redraw the map of North America. This is the story of Sarah, the most powerful woman of the 19th century who never cast a single vote. The year 1803 marked a monumental shift for the United States, as the Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size and opened the raw, dangerous Old Southwest. In the thick forests of Rutherford County, Tennessee, civilization was just beginning to take root, driven by men of immense ambition. Among them was Joel Childress, a titan of local industry who was busy carving a wealthy dynasty out of the wilderness, dealing in gold and influence while others merely struggled to survive. Into this unique blend of wild frontier and budding aristocracy, Sarah Childress was born on September 4th, 1803. While the era is often remembered for log cabins and universal poverty, her reality was starkly different. Her father's success as a planter, merchant, and land speculator ensured she was raised far from the common struggle, growing up in an environment defined by power and prosperity rather than the dirt floors of her neighbors. The Childress plantation was an island of refinement in a rough ocean. The house was not a drafty cabin, but a substantial two-story structure, bustling with the activity of enslaved laborers, business partners, and travelers. It was a place where the harsh realities of the frontier met the aspirations of the gentry. Most fathers of the early 1800s viewed daughters as liabilities to be married off or assets to be managed for household labor. Their value lay in their womb and their hands, in their ability to stitch, cook, and bear heirs. Joel Childress was different. Perhaps he saw the spark in Sarah's eyes early on. Perhaps he was simply a pragmatist who believed ignorance was a weakness regardless of gender. Joel held a radical belief for a man of his station and era. He believed that a daughter's mind was just as valuable and just as capable of cultivation as a son's. The Childress home was a hub of political and social activity. Because Joel was a prominent planter who frequently hosted travelers and dignitaries alongside his other ventures, the world came to Sarah's doorstep. Circuit court judges, militia generals, land surveyors, and politicians traveling between Nashville and Washington, D.C. would stop at the Childress estate. In most households, when the men gathered in the parlor to drink brandy and discuss the volatility of the markets or the threat of the British, the women and children were banished to the upper quarters. Sarah, however, was allowed to linger. She sat quietly in the corner, a dark-haired girl with piercing eyes, absorbing the cadence of power. She learned early that politics was not just about speeches. It was about relationships, leverage, and the strategic withholding of information. She watched her father negotiate deals and saw how charm could be weaponized just as effectively as a musket. These parlor sessions were her kindergarten of statecraft. But Joel Childress wanted more for her. As Sarah grew, her intellect outpaced the local instruction available to girls. Recognizing this, Joel and his wife Elizabeth made the decision to hire private tutors. When that proved insufficient, they enrolled Sarah and her sister at the Bradley Academy near Murfreesboro. This was a significant deviation from the norm. The Bradley Academy was primarily a school for boys, While they allowed girls to attend, the expectations were usually different. Yet the Childress girls were not there merely to socialize. They were there to learn the foundations of logic. At Bradley, Sarah was exposed to a curriculum that went far beyond the domestic arts. She didn't just learn to read, she learned to comprehend. She studied English grammar, which gave her the precise, clipped command of language that would later intimidate congressmen. She studied history, learning the rise and fall of Rome, a relevant topic for a young republic obsessed with classical ideals. But the true turning point of her life, the event that would separate her from every other woman who would eventually hold the title of First Lady, came when she was 14 years old. In 1817, Joel Childress made a decision that baffled his neighbors. He decided to send Sarah and her younger sister Susan over the Appalachian Mountains to North Carolina. Their destination was the Moravian Female Academy in Salem. To grasp the gravity of this decision, one must understand the geography of 1817. This was not a simple carriage ride. It was a perilous, weeks-long expedition through mountain passes that were often little more than widened game trails. The journey spanned nearly 500 miles of bandit-ridden, treacherous terrain. For a father to send his teenage daughter so far away at such great expense and risk spoke volumes about the value he placed on their education. Why the Moravians? The Moravians, a German Protestant sect, were unique in their educational philosophy. They believed that education was a form of worship and that women had souls and minds equal to men in the eyes of God. Consequently, the curriculum at Salem was rigorously academic, mirroring the education given to young men at universities like Princeton or Yale. When Sarah arrived in Salem, she stepped into a world of intellectual rigor she had never known existed. The academy was a place of order, discipline, and intense study. At Salem, Sarah Childress was not taught how to be a decorative object. She was taught how to be a formidable thinker. The sciences. While her peers back in Tennessee were learning to churn butter, Sarah was looking through a telescope. She studied astronomy, learning the mechanics of the celestial bodies. She studied botany and geography. This scientific training instilled in her a respect for data and facts, a trait that would later make her an invaluable asset to a husband who was obsessed with details. The classics. She read the great works of Greek and Roman literature in their original contexts. She studied the rhetoric of Cicero and the philosophy of the Stoics. She learned that empires are fragile and that leadership requires a steely control of one's emotions. The arts. She also refined her social graces. She learned to play the piano and the harp, but not merely for entertainment. The Moravians taught music as a mathematical and spiritual discipline. She learned needlework, creating intricate samplers that still exist today, though she would later famously claim she had no patience for keeping house. But the most important lesson Sarah learned at Salem was confidence. She was surrounded by intelligent, autonomous women who ran the school. She saw that female authority was not a theoretical concept, but a practical reality. She learned to speak with precision, to debate without losing her temper, and to hold her ground in an intellectual argument. She was becoming a blue stocking, a term of the time used often pejoratively to describe educated women. But Sarah wore her intelligence like armor. Her education was cut short by tragedy. In 1819, news arrived from Tennessee that Joel Childress had died. The death of the patriarch usually spelled ruin for a family in the 19th century. Without a male head of household, estates were often dissolved and fortunes lost. However, Joel had left his family wealthy and well-positioned, but for Sarah, the loss was profound. She had lost her champion, the man who had validated her intellect. At age 16, Sarah and Susan made the long, sorrowful journey back across the mountains to Tennessee. But the Sarah Childress who returned to the town of Columbia was not the same girl who had left. She was now a woman of the world. She had seen life beyond the frontier. She possessed an education superior to that of almost every man she met. She was fluent in the language of the elite, capable of discussing the Napoleonic Wars in one breath and the price of cotton in the next. Upon her return, the Childress widow and her daughters moved to Columbia, Tennessee, a bustling town south of Nashville. Here, Sarah entered the marriage market, but she was a terrifying prospect for the average suitor. She was strikingly beautiful. Descriptions from the Time note: her olive skin, her dark Spanish-looking eyes, and her raven hair parted severely in the middle. She dressed in the finest silks imported from Europe. She was wealthy, but she was also intimidating. She didn't giggle. She didn't defer. When men spoke to her, she held their gaze and corrected their facts. Most men of the Tennessee frontier wanted a wife who would manage the kitchen and raise the children. They did not want a wife who could debate the constitutionality of a national bank. Sarah knew this, and she knew that if she were to marry, she could not settle for a man who wanted a servant. She needed a man who wanted a partner. It was during this period of social suspension, a brilliant woman waiting for a worthy challenge, that the shadow of Andrew Jackson fell across her life again. General Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was the sun around which Tennessee politics orbited. He was a close friend of the Childress family. He had watched Sarah grow up. He called her daughter and treated her with a warmth he showed few others. Jackson was a shrewd judge of character. He saw in Sarah the same steel he possessed, but refined, polished, and tempered by her education. He knew that for Sarah to thrive, she needed a husband with ambition, someone who was going somewhere. And Jackson knew just the young man. There was a clerk in the state legislature, a young lawyer from Columbia named James. He was physically unimposing, often battling stomach ailments, and possessed a personality that could best be described as anxious. He was dour, humorless, and worked himself to the bone. He had none of the swagger of the typical frontiersman. But Jackson saw potential in James Knox Polk. He saw a relentless work ethic and a mind for detail that rivaled Sarah's. Jackson began to nudge the two together. It was an unlikely pairing on the surface. The vibrant, wealthy, educated Spanish doña of the Childress clan and the stiff, skinny, workaholic lawyer from the swampy end of town. But Jackson knew what he was doing. He wasn't just making a match, he was building a political machine. He knew that James needed Sarah's social grace and political instincts to soften his hard edges, and he knew that Sarah needed James's ambition as a vehicle for her own frustrated capabilities. As 1823 drew to a close, Sarah Childress began to court James Polk. She didn't just flirt with him. She evaluated him. She tested his mind. She found that, unlike other men, he didn't shy away from her intelligence. He needed it. With the courtship concluded, the theoretical potential of Sarah Childress was about to collide with the harsh realities of 19th century domesticity. The intellectual foundation laid by her father and the Moravians had prepared her for a life of the mind, but the vows she was about to take would demand a sacrifice of autonomy that few women of her caliber could endure without breaking. As the wedding guests gathered in Columbia, they saw a celebration of love. Andrew Jackson saw the launch of a political weapon, but neither the guest nor the general could foresee the private sorrow that would soon bind the couple together more tightly than any legal contract, transforming a traditional marriage into a desperate, singular partnership. On New Year's Day, 1824, the town of Columbia, Tennessee, witnessed a wedding that was, for all intents and purposes, a merger of two powerful corporations. Sarah Childress, age 20, stood beside James Knox Polk, age 28, in the parlor of her parents' home. To the casual observer, it was a mismatch. Sarah was radiant, clad in expensive silk, her dark eyes sharp and observant, radiating the health and vitality of a woman who had never known true hardship. Beside her stood James, short, slight, with a grim set to his jaw and eyes that seemed permanently tired. He was a man who looked like he was already late for a meeting. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by the elite of Tennessee society. There was feasting, fiddle music, and the clinking of glasses. But beneath the celebration, a pact had been made. James was not a romantic. He was a man consumed by a singular drive for political relevance. He had told Sarah during their courtship that he could promise her no idle life. He was a man of the legislature, a creature of the law. Sarah, in turn, had made her own terms clear. She was not interested in being a spectator. When she said "I do," she was effectively signing on as his campaign manager, his confidant, and his caretaker. A local legend persists that Andrew Jackson, present at the festivities, or shortly thereafter, offered a toast that was both a blessing and a directive. "James, she will make you president, but you must listen to her." Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment was prophetic. The ferocity of the Polk's political career was born from the isolation that descended upon their home in the years immediately following the wedding. In the 1820s, the primary duty of a wife, especially a wealthy, well-bred wife, was to produce heirs. A house without children was viewed with pity, suspicion, or religious judgment. Year 1 passed, then year 2. The nursery at the Polk home remained empty. The cause of this infertility is almost certainly traced back to James's youth. At age 17, suffering from excruciating urinary stones, James had been taken to a frontier surgeon named Dr. Ephraim McDowell. In an era before anesthesia, James was strapped to a table, given a swig of brandy, and subjected to a perineal lithotomy, a horrific procedure involving crude incisions into the bladder. While the surgery saved his life, the scar tissue and trauma likely rendered him sterile or impotent. For a young couple in the American South, this was a catastrophe. For Sarah, it meant she would never fulfill the one role society valued her for: motherhood. She would never be the matriarch of a dynasty. She would have to endure the whispers of the town gossips and the pitying looks of her sisters, who were busily filling their own nurseries. But Sarah Childress Polk was not a woman to wallow. If she could not be a mother to children, she would be a mother to a cause. She and James made a silent, strategic pivot. They took the energy, the time, and the financial resources that would have been drained by raising a large family, and they weaponized them. They turned their childlessness into a logistical advantage. While other politicians were distracted by sick children, school fees, and the demands of fatherhood, James was free to work 18 hours a day. And while other wives were confined to the home by pregnancy and nursing, Sarah was free to travel. The tragedy became the engine of their success. They became a two-person political monad, entirely self-contained and terrifyingly focused. In 1825, James was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. This was the moment Sarah broke the mold. Custom dictated that when a congressman went to Washington, his wife stayed home to manage the estate. Washington, D.C. in the 1820s was not a city. It was a muddy, malaria-ridden construction site. It was a bachelor city filled with boarding houses where men drank hard, gambled, and lived in squalor. It was no place for a lady. Sarah didn't care. She packed her trunks and went with him. They moved into a boarding house on Pennsylvania Avenue. These establishments operated on a mess system, where a group of congressmen would live and eat together at a communal table. Sarah Polk was often the only woman at the table. Imagine the scene. a long table filled with tobacco-chewing, whiskey-drinking politicians, arguing over tariffs and states' rights. And there, sitting upright in her silk and lace, was Sarah. She didn't retreat to her room. She ate the same boiled beef. She listened to the same arguments, but she did more than listen. She charmed. She debated. She used her Moravian education to dissect their arguments. The men of the mess quickly learned that Mrs. Polk was not a delicate flower to be protected from men's talk. She was a peer. Congressman Franklin Pierce and others were captivated by her. They found her conversation more stimulating than that of their colleagues. Through these dinners, Sarah built a network of allies. She learned who could be trusted, who was in debt, who was ambitious, and who was weak. She gathered intelligence and fed it to James every night in the privacy of their room. She became his eyes and ears in the social parlors he was too busy to visit. James's rise was methodical. By 1835, with the backing of President Andrew Jackson, James became the Speaker of the House. This was a brutal job. The House of Representatives in the 1830s was a violent place. Arguments frequently devolved into fistfights or duels. The Speaker had to maintain order over this chaos. The stress was immense, and James's fragile health began to fray. He suffered from chronic diarrhea and exhaustion. Sarah stepped in as his guardian. She began to manage his physical existence. She regulated his diet. She managed his correspondence, often writing letters in his name. Her handwriting was so similar to his that historians sometimes struggle to tell them apart. She also managed his finances. James was so consumed with the nation's budget that he often neglected his own. Sarah took over the management of their plantation interests and their investments. She made sure they remained solvent so he could remain pure in his politics. During this time, Sarah developed her signature style of politicking. She never told a man he was wrong. That would be unladylike. Instead, she would ask leading questions that guided him to her conclusion. She was a master of the soft power approach. She was the velvet glove around James's iron fist. In 1839, the Polks took a massive gamble. The Democratic Party in Tennessee was faltering. To save the party, Jackson ordered James to leave his powerful position as Speaker of the House and run for governor of Tennessee. It was a demotion. To leave Washington for Nashville seemed like political suicide, but Sarah understood the long game. If James could win the governorship, he would prove he could win a popular vote, something a speaker didn't have to do. It was a necessary stepping stone to the presidency. They returned to Tennessee. Sarah hit the campaign trail, an unheard of activity for a woman. She didn't give speeches, but she hosted events, charmed donors, and maintained the correspondence network. James won, but the victory was short-lived. He lost his re-election bid in 1841. He ran again in 1843 and lost again. By 1844, James K. Polk looked like a washed-up politician. He was a two-time loser. He was out of office, sitting at home in Columbia. The political world had written him off, but Sarah had not. The election of 1844 is one of the most dramatic in American history. The two presumed candidates were Martin Van Buren and Henry Clay. Both were giants of the era. However, the issue of annexing Texas and the expansion of slavery threw the race into chaos. Van Buren opposed immediate annexation, angering the southern base of his party. Andrew Jackson, dying at the Hermitage but still powerful, decided Van Buren had to go. He needed a man who believed in manifest destiny, the divine right of America to expand to the Pacific. He needed James K. Polk. The Democratic Convention was held in Baltimore. James and Sarah remained in Tennessee, anxiously awaiting news via the slow-moving telegraph and mail. The convention was deadlocked. Ballot after ballot failed to produce a winner. Then the delegates began to look for a compromise candidate, a dark horse, someone who wasn't anyone's first choice, but was acceptable to everyone. James's name was whispered, then shouted. On the 9th ballot, the convention unanimously nominated James K. Polk for president. When the news reached Tennessee, the Whigs laughed. "Who is James K. Polk?" became their mocking campaign slogan. They painted him as a nobody, a puppet of Jackson. Sarah Polk took that slogan personally. She orchestrated the domestic front of the campaign. While James wrote position papers, Sarah managed the image. She ensured that every visitor to their home left impressed by the candidate's sobriety and the candidate's wife's brilliance. She advised him to lean into the mockery. "Let them ask who you are," she reasoned. "Then tell them you are the man who will double the size of the country." She was instrumental in keeping James focused. When he wavered or grew anxious about the attacks from Henry Clay, Sarah was the steel spine. She reminded him that Clay was a gambler and a drinker, vices the American public, in the throes of the Second Great Awakening, was beginning to turn against. The election was a nail-biter. It came down to New York. In the end, the dark horse won by a razor-thin margin. As the train carried them eastward, leaving the familiar dust of Tennessee for the swampy intrigues of the capital, the Polks were not merely changing their address, they were preparing to impose their will upon a nation. The campaign had been won through strategy and silence, but governance would require a different kind of steel. Sarah knew that the dark horse victory was fragile, and that the Washington elite viewed them as temporary interlopers, to be tolerated rather than respected. She tightened her grip on the portfolio of letters in her lap, resolving that if the capital expected a rustic couple to be chewed up by the machinery of state, they were in for a rude awakening. The social season was about to be canceled. The work of empire was about to begin. On March 4th, 1845, Washington, D.C. awoke to a torrential downpour. It was a fitting start for an administration that would be defined by storm clouds and relentless struggle. As James K. Polk took the oath of office under a canopy of dripping umbrellas, Sarah stood nearby, her face composed, her eyes scanning the crowd. When the Polks entered the White House, the staff expected business as usual. The previous administration of John Tyler had been marked by social frivolity and political aimlessness. The servants prepared for balls, card games, and late-night drinking sessions. Sarah Polk shattered those expectations on day one. She and James were not there to play. They were there to work on a timeline so aggressive it bordered on the suicidal. They had 4 years, 1,460 days, to achieve 4 monumental goals. Any distraction was an enemy. Sarah immediately instituted a new code of conduct. She banned hard liquor from official functions. She banned dancing in the East Room. She refused to attend horse races or the theater on Sundays. The Washington social elite were horrified. They whispered that the Puritans had taken over. Critics would later dub the new First Lady as Sahara Sarah, painting her as a joyless religious zealot. But the critics missed the point entirely. Sarah wasn't imposing morality, she was imposing discipline. She knew James's constitution was weak. She knew that late nights, heavy drinking, and the exhausting whirl of waltzes would drain the energy he needed for governance. By killing the party atmosphere, she was preserving the president. She turned the White House from a palace of entertainment into a corporate headquarters. The true center of power in the Polk administration was not the Oval Office. It was the second floor. Traditionally, the First Lady's domain was the domestic sphere, the parlors, the kitchen, and the nursery. Sarah abdicated this role entirely. She famously told a friend, "I will neither keep house nor make butter." She delegated the domestic management to the head housekeeper and turned her attention to the West Wing's duties. She set up her own workspace in the upstairs corridor, just outside James's office. This was unprecedented. For the first time in American history, the First Lady functioned as the president's private secretary. Her daily routine was grueling. While James was in meetings, Sarah acted as the administration's filter. The mid-19th century press was vicious and partisan. Dozens of newspapers arrived at the White House daily. Sarah read them all. She scanned the National Intelligencer, the Union, and papers from London and Paris. She had an uncanny ability to spot shifting political winds. She would mark relevant articles, summarize the critiques, and brief James over private dinners. She protected him from the noise so he could focus on the signal. When politicians clamored for an audience, often just to beg for jobs, Sarah intercepted them. She charmed them, heard their requests, and often sent them away feeling heard, but without ever disturbing the president. She was the gatekeeper. The test of their partnership came swiftly. In 1846, disputes over the Texas border exploded into the Mexican-American War. This was a controversial war. In the North, it was seen as a naked land grab by slaveholders. In the South, it was a crusade. The stress on James was cataclysmic. He was a micromanager by nature. He didn't just trust his generals. He wanted to control the war from his desk. Sarah was his war room companion. As reports came in from the front lines, Rio Grande, Monterrey, Veracruz, Sarah was there. They would spread maps out on the large tables in the private study. Sarah, with her knowledge of geography from the Moravian Academy, traced the troop movements alongside him. She knew the supply lines. She knew the casualty counts. When James was too exhausted to write, she drafted correspondence to the War Department. There were nights when the gas lights of the White House burned until 3 a.m. The silhouette of the president and his lady visible to the guards outside. Two figures hunched over dispatches that would decide the fate of the continent. During this time, James's health began to collapse. He suffered from bouts of malaria and chronic diarrhea. He lost weight rapidly. Sarah became his nurse as well as his secretary. She monitored his food, forced him to rest, and famously kept the office seekers at bay when he was too weak to see them. She was the only thing keeping the engine running. While she refused to host balls, Sarah Polk was a genius at the salon. She understood that politics required socialization, but she reshaped it to her advantage. She held twice-weekly receptions where the conversation was the main event. She would sit in a large velvet chair, often wearing a turban and a high-necked black velvet dress. She held court like a queen. In these settings, Sarah was a master manipulator. When a Whig congressman was blocking James's legislation, Sarah wouldn't argue with him. She would invite him to sit by her. She would ask about his wife, his health, and then, subtly, weave in the president's perspective. She could disarm the fiercest enemy with a smile and a well-placed compliment. One of her most lasting contributions to the American presidency was born out of necessity during these crowded events. James was a small man, barely 5 feet 8 inches, and thin. When he walked into a crowded room, nobody noticed. He lacked the physical command of a Washington or a Jackson. Sarah realized this was a branding problem. She instructed the Marine Band that, upon the president's arrival at any function, they were to strike up an old Scottish tune, "Hail to the Chief." It worked. The drums rolled, the music swelled, the crowd parted, and the small man walked through the clearing with the dignity of a monarch. The tradition stuck. Every president who walks to that song today has Sarah Polk to thank. While the war raged in the South, a second crisis brewed in the North. The United States and Britain were on the brink of war over the Oregon Territory. James had campaigned on the slogan 54-40 or fight, claiming the entire territory for America. But fighting two wars at once, one against Mexico and one against the British Empire, was impossible. James had to negotiate. He had to back down from his campaign promise without looking weak. The pressure in the White House was suffocating. Sarah played a crucial role in maintaining the president's public facade. As James secretly negotiated a compromise, the press screamed betrayal. Sarah fielded the social fallout. When the wives of diplomats fished for information on the negotiations, Sarah was an impenetrable wall of polite deflection. "Mr. Polk keeps his own counsel," she would say, smiling, while knowing exactly where the treaty stood because she had likely proofread it that morning. By 1848, the end was in sight. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Mexico ceded California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The United States now stretched from sea to shining sea. The Oregon border was settled. The independent treasury was established. The tariffs were lowered. They had done it. They had achieved every single item on the impossible list. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The White House had eaten them alive. Visitors in the final year of the presidency were shocked by James's appearance. He was 53, but he looked 70. His hair had turned white. His face was a skull draped in parchment skin. He shook with exhaustion. Sarah, too, was worn down, though her iron constitution held her upright. She began to pack their belongings weeks before the inauguration of the new president, Zachary Taylor. She was desperate to get James home. She believed that the fresh air of Tennessee and the quiet of retirement would heal him. The riverboat that carried them away from the capital was supposed to be an ark of salvation, bearing them toward a long-delayed peace. They had survived the sharks of Congress, the judgment of the press, and the crushing weight of wartime leadership, believing that Polk Place would be their reward for a life of relentless service. But fate is rarely so kind to those who burn the candle at both ends. As the shoreline of the Potomac faded from view, the Polks were not escaping to a new life, but sailing unknowingly into a tragedy that would make their political struggles seem trivial by comparison. The timeline they had raced against for 4 years had finally run out. When James and Sarah Polk stepped onto the steamboat that would carry them away from Washington in March 1849, they were greeted not as retirees, but as conquering heroes. They had reshaped the continent. The public, who had once asked, "Who is James K. Polk?" now clamored to see the man who had won the West. They had planned a direct route home to Tennessee, a desperate sprint toward rest. But politics intervened one last time. Advisors and local politicians convinced James to take a grand tour through the South on his way back. They argued it was necessary to cement the loyalty of the southern states to the Union, which was already fraying at the edges. It was a fatal miscalculation. The route took them down the Atlantic coast, across the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi River. The schedule was punishing. At every stop, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, there were parades, banquets, and speeches. Thousands of people pressed in on them, shaking hands, breathing the same air. James, already weakened by 4 years of chronic stress and gastrointestinal illness, was running on fumes. Sarah, ever the protector, tried to shield him. She would often stand in front of him, shaking hands on his behalf, or cut events short with a steely glare at the organizers. But she could not stop the microscopic enemy stalking the riverboats. In 1849, a cholera epidemic was tearing through the Mississippi Valley. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of the steamboats and the packed reception halls were petri dishes for the disease. Somewhere between New Orleans and Nashville, the bacteria found the former president. They arrived in Nashville on April 2, 1849. They were exhausted, gaunt, and coughing. Their destination was a mansion James had purchased years prior, formerly known as the Grundy Place. He had renamed it Polk Place. It was meant to be their sanctuary, their Monticello. But when they arrived, it was a construction zone. The renovations were unfinished. The gardens were dug up. The house smelled of sawdust and wet paint. Boxes of their belongings from the White House, crates of books, papers, and gifts from foreign dignitaries were stacked in the hallways. For a few weeks, James rallied. He seemed to draw strength from being on Tennessee soil. He spent his days organizing his vast library, obsessively sorting the papers that documented his presidency. He and Sarah would sit in the parlor, planning the gardens. They talked of a quiet life. James wrote in his diary about the relief of being free from the vexations of office. But the reprieve was an illusion. In early June, the symptoms returned with terrifying violence. Violent cramping, dehydration, and uncontrollable diarrhea, the hallmarks of cholera, seized James. The doctors bled him. They blistered him. They administered calomel and opium. In 1849, medicine was often more dangerous than the disease, and these treatments only hastened his decline. Sarah never left his side. For days, she sat by his bed, wiping his brow, holding his hand, and watching the light fade from the eyes of the man who had been her entire world since she was 20 years old. The partnership that had run the country was now reduced to a single, quiet room in Nashville. On June 15, 1849, barely 3 months after leaving the White House, James K. Polk died. He was 53 years old. His final words were recorded as, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you." Sarah was 45. She was childless. She was alone. The silence that descended on Polk Place was deafening. The death of a husband in the Victorian era came with a strict script. A widow was expected to wear black crepe for a year, gradually moving to gray or lavender, and then eventually returning to normal colors. She was expected to mourn, but eventually to move on. Sarah Polk tore up the script. She put on black mourning weeds, heavy rustling silk dresses, black bonnets, and black veils, and she effectively never took them off for the next 42 years. She did not just mourn James, she canonized him. She decided that her life's remaining purpose was to serve as the guardian of his memory. She turned Polk Place into a shrine. James was not buried in a local cemetery. Due to cholera fears and legal disputes, he was initially buried in a mass grave, but Sarah fought to have him moved. Eventually, she secured permission to bury him right there on the front lawn of Polk Place. She designed the tomb herself. It was a limestone structure designed by William Strickland, the architect of the Tennessee State Capitol. She placed it within view of her bedroom window. Every morning when she woke up, and every evening before she slept, the first and last thing she saw was James's grave. Inside the house, she preserved his study exactly as he had left it. His pens, his books, and his papers were left untouched, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. She became the curator of a museum of one. However, if one assumes Sarah Polk spent the next 4 decades weeping in a dark room, they underestimate her. She was still Sarah Childress. She was still the sharpest political mind in the South. As the 1850s progressed, Polk Place transformed. It ceased to be a mere home and became an institution. Sarah realized that her status as a former First Lady gave her a unique form of soft power. She was American royalty. She began to host. She didn't throw parties. That would be unseemly for a widow. She held levee. Distinguished visitors passing through Nashville felt obligated to pay their respects to Madame Polk. The guest list was a who's who of 19th century America. Past and future presidents, governors, writers, and generals came to sit in her parlor. They came expecting a frail widow. They found a woman with a razor-sharp intellect who wanted to discuss the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sarah used these visits to carefully curate James's legacy. When historians or journalists asked about the Mexican War, Sarah was there to correct the narrative, ensuring James was painted as a decisive leader rather than a warmonger. She controlled the access to his papers. If you wanted to write about Polk, you had to go through Sarah. As the decade wore on, the conversation in Sarah's parlor grew darker. The union that James had expanded was tearing itself apart. The question of slavery, the very issue James had tried to manage through expansion, was now boiling over. Sarah's position was complicated. She was a staunch Democrat. She was a Southerner. And, it must be noted, she was a slaveholder. She owned a plantation in Mississippi managed by agents, which provided her income. She owned enslaved people who worked at Polk Place. Her wealth and her comfort were built on the institution of slavery. Yet she was also a Unionist. Her husband had been the President of the United States. He had added California and Oregon to the map. She revered the federal government and the Constitution. She watched with horror as the rhetoric heated up. She saw the rise of the fire eaters, radical Southern secessionists, and the black Republicans in the North. She blamed the abolitionists for agitating the issue, believing they were destroying the social order, but she also feared the reckless aggression of the Southern hotheads. In 1860, the dam broke. Abraham Lincoln was elected. South Carolina seceded. Sarah sat in her parlor at Polk Place, surrounded by the portraits of the founding fathers and her late husband. Outside, the streets of Nashville were filling with young men waving Confederate flags, eager for war. They cheered for secession. Sarah did not cheer. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, what war actually looked like. She had run a war from the White House. She knew the cost of logistics, the horror of the casualty lists, and the fragility of nations. For over a decade, Sarah maintained her lonely vigil, a solitary figure draped in crape, tending to a grave while the nation around her began to unravel. The compromise and diplomacy that James had mastered were replaced by the shrill cries of fanatics on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. As the 1850s bled into the 1860s, the Queen of Tennessee watched from her window as the union her husband had expanded began to crack under the strain of its own growth. The war he had feared was no longer a distant threat. It was an approaching army. Soon, the sanctity of her grief would be interrupted by the roar of cannons, forcing the guardian of the tomb to become a diplomat once again. By June 1861, Tennessee had cast its lot with the Confederacy. It was the last state to secede, torn between its mountain Unionists in the east and the plantation owners in the west. Sarah Polk, a woman of the planter class whose wealth was tied to cotton and enslaved labor, sided with her kin. In her heart, she was a Confederate. However, she was also a living symbol of the Federal Union. Her husband had been the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. His name was signed on the treaties that defined the nation's borders. This duality placed her in a unique, almost paradoxical position. While other Southern ladies spent their time sewing Confederate flags and scolding men who hadn't enlisted, Sarah adopted a stance of regal detachment. She did not publicly denounce the North. She did not give fire-eating speeches. Instead, she retreated into the sanctuary of Polk Place. She understood that her home was not just a private residence. It was a presidential monument. When the Confederate Army initially held Nashville, the officers flocked to her door. They saw her as a link to the Old South's glory. She received them graciously, but those closest to her noted a deep anxiety. She feared the destruction of the Union her husband had worked so hard to expand. She feared for her property, and she feared for the grave on her front lawn. The war arrived sooner than anyone expected. In February 1862, Fort Donelson fell to a scruffy, cigar-chomping Union general named Ulysses S. Grant. The Confederate defense of Nashville collapsed. The rebel army fled south, leaving the city open to the Federal advance. Panic swept Nashville. Citizens burned bridges, looted stores, and fled in terror. The Vandals were coming. Sarah Polk did not flee. Friends and family begged her to evacuate to the Deep South. They warned her that the Union soldiers would loot her home, desecrate the president's grave, and perhaps arrest her. Sarah refused. Her logic was simple and steely. This is the home of James K. Polk. I will not abandon it. She stayed in the mansion with her adopted niece, Sally Jetton, and her servants. She locked the gates. She dressed in her finest black silk, and she waited for the enemy. The Union Army, under General Don Carlos Buell, occupied Nashville. The city was placed under martial law. Churches were turned into hospitals. Homes were commandeered for officers. But when Union officers arrived at the gates of Polk Place, they did not kick down the door. They knocked. General Buell, a man of strict discipline and respect for institutions, issued a remarkable order. He declared that the home of the late president was to be treated as neutral ground. It was sacred soil. No soldiers were to be quartered there. No property was to be seized. Sarah Polk, the widow of a Democrat who expanded the slave power, was arguably the most protected person in occupied Nashville. Buell himself came to call. The scene was surreal. Sarah received the conquering general in her parlor. She did not spit on him. She offered him tea. She treated him not as an invader, but as a guest of the state. This set a precedent. For the next 3 years, Polk Place became a bizarre Switzerland in the heart of the war zone. The list of Union generals who paid their respects to Sarah Polk reads like a roll call of the Union High Command: Don Carlos Buell, William Rosecrans, George Thomas, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant. Why did they come? Partly it was curiosity. She was a legend. But partly it was a craving for civilization. These men were spending their days amidst blood, mud, and the hatred of the local population. To step into Polk Place was to step back in time to a more orderly world. It was a place of refinement, where the war was never mentioned directly, only alluded to. Sarah played her role perfectly. She was charming and witty. She reminded them of the dignity of the office her husband had held, but she never compromised her principles. There is a famous anecdote involving a young Union officer who, perhaps emboldened by alcohol or arrogance, tried to bait her. "Madam," he said, "I assume you are hoping for a defeat of our forces." Sarah fixed him with a cold stare and replied, "Sir, I reside in the home of a President of the United States. I have never known a defeat of American arms, and I trust I never shall." It was a master class in ambiguity. She had asserted American supremacy without admitting which America she was rooting for. The most dangerous moment came when the military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, instituted a harsh policy. He demanded that prominent citizens sign an oath of loyalty to the United States or face imprisonment and confiscation of property. The pressure on Sarah to sign was immense. If the former First Lady signed, it would be a massive propaganda victory for the Union. If she refused, Johnson, a man who hated the planter aristocracy, would have every right to arrest her. Sarah Polk refused to sign, but she didn't refuse with defiance. She refused with protocol. She essentially argued that her husband's service and her position placed her above such petty bureaucracies. She implied that questioning the loyalty of Mrs. James K. Polk was an insult to the presidency itself. Remarkably, the Union command backed down. While other women were being banished north or thrown in prison for lesser offenses, Sarah was exempted. Her shadow power protected her when armies could not. Perhaps the most telling encounter occurred when Generals Grant and Sherman visited her together. These were the men who would burn Atlanta and crush Lee. They were the destroyers of the South. Sarah received them in the parlor. Sherman, who had a deep respect for order, was reportedly enchanted by her. Grant, a man of few words, was respectful. When they left, Sarah politely walked them to the door. As they stood on the portico, looking out at the tomb of James K. Polk, Sarah said to them, "General, I trust you will protect this grave?" Grant nodded. He placed a guard at the gate with specific orders. Anyone disturbing Mrs. Polk or the tomb would be shot. The stillness that followed the surrender at Appomattox brought a peace that was, for Sarah, almost as devastating as the war itself. The armies had retreated, leaving her home standing, but her world shattered. The protection of the generals was gone, replaced by the cold arithmetic of a new economic order where land meant nothing without labor and prestige could not buy bread. Yet as the smoke of the Civil War cleared to reveal the industrial grime of the Gilded Age, the Lady of Polk Place refused to fade into obscurity. She had survived the loss of her husband and the death of her country. Now she would have to master the art of survival in a century that was rapidly leaving her behind, turning her from a player in the game of power into a living monument of a lost era. When the smoke of the Civil War cleared in 1865, Sarah Polk looked out upon a world that had fundamentally changed. The South was broken, occupied, and undergoing a painful reconstruction. Nashville, once a genteel frontier town, was rapidly becoming a smoky industrial city. The immediate crisis for Sarah was not political, but existential. The war had obliterated her wealth. Her Mississippi plantation, the source of her income, was in ruins. Her enslaved workforce was free. Her stocks and bonds, largely tied to the Confederate economy, were worthless paper. Yet she still lived in a palace. Polk Place remained one of the grandest homes in Tennessee, filled with French porcelain and velvet draperies. This created a jarring dissonance. Sarah was a celebrity who struggled to pay the grocer. She faced this new reality with the same pragmatic steel she had used to run the White House. She didn't complain publicly. She didn't beg. Instead, she liquidated assets. She sold the plantation land for a fraction of its pre-war value. She quietly sold off excess furniture. She lived with extreme frugality, cutting off wings of the house to save on heating, eating simple meals, and relying on the loyalty of a few former servants who stayed on as paid employees. She was land poor and house poor, but she refused to look poor. When visitors came, and they came in droves, she received them in the same black silk dresses, mended and cared for, sitting beneath the portrait of her husband, projecting an air of unbroken prosperity. As the 19th century ground toward its close, a strange phenomenon occurred. As the partisan hatreds of the 1840s and the bloody wounds of the 1860s began to heal, Sarah Polk transformed from a political figure into a national grandmother. She became a living relic. She was the last link to the Age of Giants, the era of Jackson, Clay, and Webster. To a generation of Americans born after the Civil War, she was a figure from a history book who was somehow still breathing in downtown Nashville. Polk Place became a mandatory stop for any dignitary visiting the South. It became a neutral ground once again, not between armies, but between political parties. President Rutherford B. Hayes visited her in 1877. Grover Cleveland visited in 1887. They came to kiss the ring. They found a tiny, withered woman who still possessed a terrifyingly sharp mind. She didn't want to talk about her health. She wanted to discuss tariff reform. She critiqued their policies with a politeness that made her disagreements sting all the more. One famous visitor was the labor organizer Eugene V. Debs. It is a testament to her breadth that she could entertain a radical socialist and a Gilded Age industrialist in the same parlor, charming them both. She had mastered the art of being a historic sight while she was still alive. Sarah would not have survived those lonely decades without the presence of Sally Jetton. Sally was Sarah's great-niece. Her mother had died when Sally was young, and Sarah had taken the girl in. Since Sarah had no children of her own, Sally became the daughter of her heart. Sally dedicated her entire life to Sarah. She acted as her companion, her secretary, and the manager of the crumbling estate. She married a man named George Fall, and they raised their own daughter, Saidee, within the walls of Polk Place. This brought a burst of life back into the silent mansion. For the first time in decades, the sound of a child playing echoed in the halls. Sarah, the austere Sahara Sarah, softened. She doted on little Saidee. There are touching accounts of the elderly, black-clad matriarch playing simple games with the child in the shadow of the president's tomb. It was the domestic joy she had been denied in her own marriage. By the 1880s, Sarah's financial situation was dire. The United States Congress, realizing the embarrassment of having a former First Lady potentially dying in poverty, moved to grant her a pension. It was a sum of $5,000 a year. While modest by the standards of the robber barons of the era, for Sarah, it was a lifeline. It allowed her to keep the roof patched and the fires burning. It was a belated recognition by the government that she had served the nation just as faithfully as any soldier. Sarah Polk lived so long that she became an anachronism. She was born when Thomas Jefferson was president and the U.S. ended at the Mississippi River. She lived to see the telephone, the electric light bulb, and the railroad spanning the continent. She saw the country grow from 17 states to 44. She remained lucid to the very end. In her late 80s, she was still reading the newspapers every morning, though her eyesight was failing. She remained a devout Presbyterian, spending hours in prayer and Bible study, preparing for the reunion she had waited 40 years for. In June 1891, she fell ill with a fever. It was just a few weeks before her 88th birthday. As she lay in her bed at Polk Place, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, she remained calm. She had outlived her husband, her siblings, her enemies, and her era. On August 14, 1891, Sarah Childress Polk died. Sarah's funeral was a state event. Tennessee mourned its queen. She was buried next to James on the front lawn of Polk Place, just as she had promised. The tomb finally held them both, but the story has a bitter postscript. In her will, Sarah left Polk Place to the state of Tennessee to be preserved as a memorial to James K. Polk. She wanted it to be a Mount Vernon for the volunteer state. However, the greedy relatives, a swarm of nieces and nephews who felt entitled to the Childress Polk fortune, challenged the will. They argued that the will was invalid or violated laws against perpetuities. The courts, in a shameful decision, sided with the relatives. The will was broken. The shrine that Sarah had protected through a civil war, financial ruin, and 42 years of widowhood was sold to the highest bidder. In 1901, just 10 years after her death, Polk Place was demolished to build an apartment complex. The bodies of James and Sarah were disinterred and moved to the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol, where they lie today. It is a dignified spot, but it is not the home they built. The library, the parlor where she courted generals, the study where they planned the Mexican War, it is all gone, erased by the very progress Sarah helped shepherd. Sarah Childress Polk was more than a footnote. She was a bridge between the founding of America and the modern era. In a time when women were legally invisible, she made herself seen. She did not challenge the patriarchy by shouting from the outside. She infiltrated it. She walked into the smoke-filled rooms and proved she was the smartest person there. She was a complex figure, a slaveholder who defended the Union, a submissive wife who commanded the government, a Puritan who played the game of politics better than the sinners. She and James were a partnership unique in American history. As she once famously said, when a guest admired the way she handled the president's business, "Sir, if I get into the White House, I will not stay in the background." She kept that promise. And in doing so, she redefined what a woman could be in the halls of American power.